Chapter 2. Daniel drove off I-75 and got on King's Highway. He looked around. Yeah, the usual highway businesses were there, gas stations, convenience stores, and fast food restaurants. Ah, and there was Veterans Boulevard. The journey was nearly done. He was glad of that. His behind was just about glued to the seat. The neighbourhood was the same, no changes in the streets and homes in so short a time. It took a few minutes, but he finally reached Cake Terrace and pulled into the driveway. Climbing out of the car, he looked around. Well, the big outcropping of limestone was still covered in weeds. Dad still hadn't hired someone to clean it up. As the house was on a corner lot, those stones made a great landmark to guide you to the place. The house looked a little worse for wear. It was clear that the gutters hadn't been cleaned and the paint was peeling from around the windows. Yeah, same old Dad. The place had so much potential. It wasn't very old. His dad had gotten it built back in 2000. He said it was his millennium gift to himself, but Daniel figured it was his way of making a clean break with the past. The thing was, Dad was getting up there in years, over 70, and he'd been a general contractor. What this meant was, when something was needing doing around the house, he knew how to do it, but he was too old to actually do it. So he refused to hire anyone to do the work. As a result, nothing ever got done around the place. He grabbed his bag and headed up the walk to the front door. Yeah, the standard ranch-style cinder block home. There must be millions of them all over Florida. He tried his key and found it still worked. That was Dad for you. Never put off tomorrow what you can put off to next year. Opening the door, he stepped into the small living room. Daniel rolled his eyes. Would Dad never change? The place could have looked nice if someone just cleaned it once in a while. The TV stand stood in the bay window next to the door, and a couch faced it across a low oval coffee table. Behind the couch was the high bar counter that separated the room from the kitchen. From the condition of the room, it was clear Dad was, once again, living in the living room. A stack of newspapers was next to the couch and scattered across the coffee table. In amongst more papers were TV dinner trays, empty bottles and glasses, and the odd dirty piece of silverware. "Who's there?" came Dad's gravelly voice from the bedroom. A moment later, there was Dad, Alex Mayhew, in all his unkept glory, standing in the doorway just beyond the end of the couch. Daniel looked up at him and down. That pot-belly was getting just a bit bigger, and his pure white hair was a bit long. He needed a haircut and a shave. For a man of his age, he really didn't look that bad. Of course, if he'd wear something more than a bathrobe, it'd help a lot more. Daniel sniffed. Yeah, if Dad could cut down on the Southern Comfort and Coke, he'd also do a lot better. "Daniel, my boy, it's good to see you," he said, his speech slightly slurred. Daniel moved around the easy chair near the door, dropped his backpack onto it, and crossed to Dad. He threw out his hand to him. "And you, Pop, how you doing? You look pretty good." He shook Daniel's hand and smiled. "That's how things always are with you, aren't they? It's always pretty good. Gee, son, can't anything be better than that? You look thin. How about a decent meal?" "Sure, where do you want to go eat?" Daniel replied, trying to sound innocent. Alex laughed. "Always with the jokes. Come on, I'll put some water on, and we'll whip up some of our secret spaghetti sauce." With that, he turned and sort of stumbled toward the kitchen. Daniel followed and grimaced at the sight of the sink. Phew, what a stench. Had Dad not washed a dish since he left? On the other side of the bar counter was that sink, overflowing with filth, and then the counter ran around to the wall and down to the refrigerator. The stove, set in the counter and just to the left of the fridge, looked like it hadn't been used in months. Talk about being pristine and perfect. So Dad was back to his old ways, using the microwave. Alex opened a cabinet in the island counter, pulled out a large pot, and somehow filled it with water. He nearly dropped it, but managed to get it on the stove. Meanwhile, Daniel started loading the dishwasher. It, like the stove, was unused. "Pop, the washer is right there next to the sink. Is there some reason you don't load it?" "Oh, why bother? I never have many dishes." Daniel looked at the stack in the sink and on the counter. "What do you call this?" "Well, okay, so they pile up after a couple of weeks. It's no big deal. Here, I'll put the kettle on and we can have some tea with dinner too. Just like old times. How's that sound?" Daniel sighed. "Yeah, sure. Great, Pop." "Oh, gee, try to contain yourself," Alex said, making no effort to hide his sarcasm. "Pop, I'm not 12 anymore. There's nothing wrong with tradition. Remember your mother always appreciated such things." "Yeah, okay. Tea," Daniel replied and filled the kettle. Once it was on, Alex set about getting the sauce ready. As Daniel had expected, he had a big pot of it sitting in the fridge. It was one of few things in the fridge, for that matter. Putting it on a back burner, they turned it on a low heat and then set about setting the table. The little eat-in nook was just around the corner from the kitchen, right under another bay window. Daniel smiled. At least this table was clean. Of course, finding enough clean dishes for the two of them to use was a challenge, but he managed. So, Pop, what do you hear from Gabriella? Oh, she's fine. Hasn't been around much. I'm sure that she's got finals or something coming up soon, Alex said. She a senior now? Daniel asked. Yes. You want to call her if she's free for dinner? No, I'll call her later. Okay. So, son, while it's great to have you come back to visit, tell me, what's up? Things didn't work out at the lab. I got things all messed up again, Alex said, his tone carrying a hint of gloating about it. No, if anything, I did quite well. It's just my ideas weren't accepted and I quit. Alex snorted again, bigger and louder. Oh, you quit, did you? That's a switch. Pop, drop it, okay? Now come on, I want to find a new direction in my life and I'd like to move back in, but if you don't want that, I'll see about finding a place in town. I just figured you could use the company. Have Phil or Patrick been around at all? Alex turned away, a pained look playing across his face as he did. No was all he could say. Daniel didn't have to hear more. He could hear the ache in his father's voice, and he immediately felt a stab to his gut. He'd hurt Alex and gone too far, and he knew it. I... oh, well, why don't we sit down and eat, Pop? We could talk while we eat. Alex cleared his throat and turned to the fridge. Sure, I'll get the milk for the tea. His timing was perfect. The kettle was just starting to whistle. Daniel remembered where the Earl Grey was kept. He got it and scalded the pot and made the tea before the water got burned. He had to laugh to himself. They might be sciatic old Englanders, long transplanted to Florida, and they drank tea like proper Englishmen. Over dinner they talked, and Alex agreed to let Daniel move back in. Long before they were done eating, Alex had fallen asleep in his chair. Daniel sighed and started to clean up. Yeah, same old Pop. He'd leave him to sleep. If he followed his usual routine, he'd wake up in time for the Tonight Show. It was regular as clockwork. Once the dishes were in the dishwasher and the leftovers in the fridge, Daniel unpacked his stuff. Yeah, his old room was just as he'd left it. That was Pop, king of the procrastinators. Oh well, tomorrow he'd start anew. Kelly sat in her office and looked out over the Miami skyline. She had to wonder, was the city safe? Before her was the printout from her latest computer model, and she did not like the look of it. Such a beautiful city, and yet Kelly knew that it was wrong. It was all wrong. She stood up and crossed the window. From here, from this floor, she could almost see the beach area. No, not the beach. It was a coast, but it was not a beach. The place known as Miami Beach was many things, but it was not a beach. Not for a long time. She sighed. That place disgusted her. It was development run amok. Development to the nth degree. She was no dummy. She knew the score when it came to real estate. Her older brother was a broker up on Cape Cod. She knew that coastal property was most valuable and thus highly sought after by everyone. Not only did brokers love to sell such lots, but states loved them for the tax revenue they generated. Yet she also knew that it was wrong, all wrong. Those massive hotels right down on Miami Beach were prime targets for destruction. Had Hurricane Andrew hit that area, those places would have been reduced to kindling and twisted metal. And now, with the report in her hand, she knew that it was time to go and tell the committee what had to be done. As if reading her mind, the intercom buzzed. Kelly, the meeting starts in 5. Kelly turned toward the phone. Thanks, Jenny. I'll be right in. Flipping through the report one last time just to be sure the printer hadn't eaten a page, she moved to the door and flipped off the light. She grinned. Yeah, the gang all kidded her about that, but she was always looking to do her part and conserve. Standing there, she suddenly thought of Daniel. Now, why was that? She knew it was the contrast between their offices. She could not believe that he could find anything in this massive mountain of junk. Hers was the picture of order and decorum. Of course, some people said that she was obsessive-compulsive. Others said she was a bit monkish. She didn't get the reference until they explained about the TV show. Kelly hoped she wasn't that bad. It was only that she tried to live by that old saying, a place for everything and everything in its place. Anyway, time for the meeting. She stepped out into the narrow hallway and headed toward the front of the building. Looking around, she couldn't help but think that the place could use a good paint job, and the well-worn carpeting needed replacing. But this was the National Hurricane Center. Such things were luxuries here. As she walked along, other doors opened and her co-workers joined the growing throng. Yes, it was a monthly staff meeting, and she knew that they had a very full agenda. So she made a point of not having the usual third cup of coffee beforehand. They reached the main reception area, a broad and open area of linoleum and fluorescent lights. Kelly always liked the big glass entryway. It always seemed so inviting and friendly. And that's what she felt this place should be. After all, they were here to serve the public, so the public should feel comfortable coming here. She paused to look over the area. Yeah, it needed tidying up too, but that wasn't in the budget either. Well, there was more important things to consider. Turning her head to the right, she could see everyone else filing into the conference room. Kelly made her way inside and moved to one of the tables off to the left. She couldn't help but laugh at the difference between this room and the one over at the National Science Board. This one, it was more like a classroom with a half a dozen rectangular tables arranged to allow everyone to have a seat. Once everyone was seated, Mr. Fenton, the director, stepped in front of the class, as the staff called themselves, and moved to stand in front of the blackboard. Now was when they truly felt like students in a class. Of course, his appearance added to that. He looked like a classic school principal, distinguished old gentleman, a proper suit and tie, and a face locked in an almost permanent scowl. With that, he began the first item on their agenda. Finally, about a half an hour later, it felt like 10 hours, it was Kelly's turn to speak. She rose and headed for the head of the class as Mr. Fenton sat down. "Thank you, Mr. Fenton," she said, and held up her report. "All right, we've all seen my report. The storms we've been getting these last few years have been real bullbusters, pardon the language. It's time for us to take action." Mr. Fenton groaned. "Kelly, you're not going to go on about global warming again, are you?" "Mr. Fenton, the evidence is inconclusive," he snapped. "We are merely entering into a period of greater hurricane activity." "All right, let's agree to disagree. Agreed?" Kelly said. Mr. Fenton nodded. "Agreed." Snickers sounded throughout the room. He turned and silenced them with a frown. "Anyway," Kelly continued, "my thought is this. If we're not only entering a phase of more frequent storms, bigger storms, I truly believe that there will come a day when we have to create a new category of hurricanes, a Category 6. There followed a loud babble of cries from the room, most clearly shouts of scorn and derision. All right, people, settle down," Fenton snapped. "This is not how we conduct ourselves. Kelly, you can't be serious. Category 5 is as big as they get, and that's all there is to it." Kelly nodded. "Yes, but that's part of my research in looking at the history of recent storms, their formation, duration, strength. I'm convinced that we'll one day see a storm with winds around 185 miles per hour and gusts topping out at 235. There followed more chaos and shouts, as still more of the staff jeered and mocked Kelly. "We must do something to better protect the public and minimize the costs of all storms, no matter what their cause," Kelly shouted. Fenton again silenced the staff and smiled at Kelly. "Ah, now you're starting to think in the right direction," he replied. "So what do you think, more sea walls and breakwaters?" "No, something far better. We need to instigate a program whereby the government buys up coastal properties, tears them down, and lets everything go back to nature. It's a perfect—" "What?" Fenton bellowed. "Are you out of your mind, Kelly? The cost would be massive and no one will want to give up their homes." "Mr. Fenton, people are much more environmentally conscious than you think," Kelly replied, staying calm in the face of his increasingly red face. "Once we announce this program, I'm sure many people would donate their land to it and others will sell at a reasonable price." Fenton rolled his eyes. "Kelly, what color is the sky in your world? Are you truly naive enough to think people would part with some of the most valuable real estate in the world because it's the right thing to do?" "There's no need to be insulting, sir," she sniped. "Some of these people have owned their land for years. They've gotten their use out of it. Some others inherited it. So what cost is there to them to give it up? Why wouldn't they be willing to donate it? Besides, think of the great tax write-off they'll get." Fenton threw up his arms, sighed, and resumed his seat. "Impossible. You're completely impossible." "That's your opinion, sir. Now, may I continue with my—" "No, you may not. You're done. Sit down." "What?" "Mr. Fenton, I have a ton of data regarding my theory on the Category 6 story, and a detailed plan for the savings of our shores. Now, yes, initial costs will be considerable, but the long-term savings and benefits will more than make—" "Kelly," Fenton snapped, jumping to his feet, "we have a very full agenda today, and I'm not wasting our time on one fantasy that will never happen and another that will never be approved." "Sir, isn't that a matter for the full committee to decide?" Fenton snorted and looked around the room. "Anyone want to hear more about Kelly's theory or going to vote in favor of her proposal?" Kelly scanned the faces of her co-workers, and her jaw dropped as not one of them nodded or raised their hand. Nothing. Not 1 ounce of support from anyone, yet she wasn't going to show sadness or weakness. Standing tall, she moved to her chair, picked up her notepad, and marched for the door. "Mr. Fenton, you will have my resignation on your desk before the meeting is over." A general murmur of protest rippled across the room. Fenton waved his hands, gesturing for everyone to stay silent. "Kelly, isn't that a bit much? I mean, aren't you cutting your nose off to spite your face? Please, stay. You're a valuable member of—" "No," she replied. "If this is the prevailing mood, then there's no place for me here. Changes must be implemented and the public warned, and I'm going to work for both of them." "The best way to effect change in any institution is from within," Fenton said. Kelly shook her head. "Not this level of change. No, it's clear I need to work to educate the public. The next generation is the best hope for the future." "So what will you do?" "I don't know. Let's see what the fates have in store for me. Good day, people." With that, Kelly left the room and made her way back to her office. Whoa, had she really just quit her job? Good God, now what the hell was she going to do? Well, there was no sense trying to patch things up with Fenton, so she wrote a quick note of resignation, signed it, and put it in her outbasket. Jennifer would deliver it. Popping her flash drive into her computer, she copied some files over and then logged off for the last time. Standing up, she looked around the room. There wasn't much for her to do, the place was organised enough. So she got her family pictures off of the wall, disconnected her little stereo, and grabbed a box from under her desk. Once everything was packed, she gathered the box into her arms and turned the light off with her elbow for the last time. Walking back out to the reception area, she gave a last glance toward the conference room. So she was really going to do this. Where would she go? It was a good question. She looked down into the box in her arms and saw the pictures. Well, her parents could be quite trying, but why not go home for a visit? Who knows, maybe she could find a clue as to where her future lay by going backward just a bit. It took a couple of weeks, but Kelly got everything taken care of. She was lucky her roommate understood about her leaving and was also able to find someone to step in and take over her share of the costs. Hey, when you've got a plum apartment near downtown Miami, people were just about lining up to be your new pal. So Kelly piled her beat-up old stuff into her equally beat-up old Fonda Civic and took off. She wanted to listen to her iPod, but had packed it, so she made do with the local radio stations. God, some of them were so lame. Still, she hardly took note of them. No, she was thinking about what lay before her, seeing the family again. It'd been, 2 years since her last visit? Yeah, about that. It'd been right before the 4th of July back in '07. Kelly laughed out loud. That was the thing about coming back from a family of witnesses, as they didn't celebrate anything but anniversary. There weren't many reasons to go visit. Frankly, she wasn't looking forward to this. Her last visit had been right after graduating college, and she had been so excited to show off her new diploma. There she was, 22, fresh out of college and ready to start work at the National Hurricane Center. Then she came home and had to listen to yet another sermon from Mum and Dad. It was always the same issues. Come back to the church. The end of time was near, and she should get married and start a family. Her older siblings had done that. Why not her? She laughed again. God, her life reminded her of that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Unfortunately, her visit with her family didn't have a Hollywood ending. Well, come to think of it, it sort of did. After all, a lot more movies these days were what they called edgy. They didn't have the classic ending or the sobfest, tearjerker ending. No, they were bleak and depressing, just like real life. Of course, Kelly never understood why someone would pay to see real life. Hell, she lived it every day and no one paid to watch her life. At any rate, piercing words passed between all parties involved, and she'd left, slamming the door behind her. She had to wonder, was that door now closed to her for all time? She knew the tenets of the church. To be disfellowship was like being excommunicated. Still, they were family, and she knew that family meant love. So she kept driving. Before her, waves of heat rose from the asphalt pavement, so she kept the air conditioning blasting and the windows rolled up. She didn't have a thermometer, but she knew today was another scorcher. How anyone could see the rise in temperatures and the lengthening of the summer and not see that global warming was real was beyond her. Still, as she'd learned the hard way when someone's livelihood depended on them not accepting something, people could be like the proverbial ostrich. When at last she reached Punta Gorda, she kept an eye out for good old US-17. It was easy enough to spot and would take her straight into Arcadia. The area hadn't changed much. As Kelly recalled, this area had been voted the best small town to live in, or something like that, by a magazine some years back. It might be the case for adults and older citizens, but not so much for kids. She remembered her teen years in the area. There'd been a dearth of things to do. Now sure, there was always the beach, but how many times can you go there before it starts to get old? And her parents wondered why she didn't want to stay in Arcadia. Still, the community was beautiful, a real Florida natural wonderland. She had to wonder, was it spending her formative years here that gave her a love of nature? The road wound and meandered through the countryside past the old Florida homes, the little stores and businesses, and the new McMansions, as they were called. She was a little surprised at the sizes of some of the homes and how new they were, yet it made a sort of sense. Most of the really choice coastal lands were taken, more's the pity. But there were also the swamps and palm trees, the moss-laden oaks, and the waters of the Peach River emptying into Charlotte Harbour. Yeah, a very beautiful area, one worthy of protecting. Long about mid-afternoon she caught sight of the outskirts of Arcadia. No, the place hadn't changed much. Little in Arcadia ever did. The city was such a stereotype. It had railroad tracks running right down the middle, and they separated the town into two distinct zones, the place of the rich and the place of the poor. The wealthy were made up of the fruit grove owners and cattle barons. The poor were the fruit pickers and labourers. There weren't many middle-class people in Arcadia. The joke around town was that Kelly's family made up about 50% of the town's middle class. So pulling on to Hargrave, it was easy to find the family's house. It was the nice brick house, the only one among all the beaten and battered mobile homes. Pulling into the driveway, she groaned. The yard was packed with cars, so it was clear that Mum and Dad had told the whole family she was coming home. Oh boy, it was a proverbial prodigal daughter, returning to the family. She just hoped they hadn't made veal. Once she'd parked and climbed out, she heard Junior yapping away. Yeah, Mum's little rat dog. That long-haired chihuahua of hers was still on guard. Immediately after that came voices of Uncle Bill and Aunt Angie, Nick, Kimberly, Mum and Dad. Yeah, they were all there. Kelly said a silent prayer and moved to the door. "She's home," Kimberly shouted with a squeal and threw the door open. Next thing Kelly knew, her little sister had thrown herself into her arms. "Whoa, Kim," Kelly said with a smile. "Girl, you aren't 6 anymore. You're going to knock me over. How you been?" Kim pulled back from their embrace and held up her left hand for Kelly to see. A small diamond ring adorned her fourth finger. "Oh, I'm just fine. Can't you tell?" Kelly's jaw dropped for a moment, and she felt tightness in her chest. She couldn't believe her eyes. She actually had to blink twice to be sure she was seeing what she was seeing. "Kim, what is this for real, girl? You're only 18. That's the same age I was when your dad and I tied the knot," their mother said. Kelly turned her head slightly. Yeah, there was good old Mum. She was getting a bit frumpy looking as she got older. Kelly had to wonder, would she get such massive love handles later in her life? Oh, she hoped not. "Mum, that was, 50 years ago?" Kelly said. These days, women don't have to go from their parents' home to their husbands directly. Suddenly, Nick was in the door, tall and scrawny as ever, a wide grin on his face as he looked at his watch. "And we have a new record, fighting in under a minute." Mum rolled her eyes. "Nick, we are not fighting, goodness. As I always said, we can at least agree to disagree. Agreed?" Kelly cringed. Oh God, that's where she learned that phrase. Was the old saying, "Did all women become their mothers," true? Oh, she hoped that was not true either. "Yes, please, let's make this a nice visit," Kimberly said. "Come on, come inside and I'll tell you all about him. We want to have the wedding in the spring and I want you to be one of my bridesmaids." "Can't you just see it, sis?" Nick asked. "You, the one old maid in amongst all of Kim's teeny bopper friends?" Nick's sarcasm was so thick, Kelly could just about cut it with a knife. With that, they went inside. The place hadn't changed a bit, other than Mother had moved the couch from the wall opposite the door to under the window and put the piano where the couch had been. Kelly guessed she'd done that for Junior so he could climb up and look out of the window. Oh, she treated that dog better than most of the family members. The place had that classic country-style look, which her mother loved. Kelly, she had never cared for it. That was one of the pleasures of living in Miami, getting to live around the modern architecture. Dad came forward and gave Kelly a brief hug, which for him was a declaration of total love. He looked good. He'd lost a bit of weight and clearly been getting some sun. He was a true Irishman. He was milky white skin and he freckled whenever he got sun. He had a lot of freckles, and then Uncle Bill and Aunt Angie followed. Kelly often wondered about herself. When she looked at her parents, they both had that fire engine red hair. So why was she blonde? Nick always joked that Kelly looked too much like the UPS man. Mum and Dad did not appreciate his brand of humour. The place was a snug little house. Kelly had to admit her mum kept a tidy home. Of course, that's probably where Kelly got her obsession with being neat and orderly. She clearly didn't get it from her dad. Oh God, she could just imagine what his workshop in the garage looked like. A pile of everything, and everything in its pile. Kelly sniffed the air. Yeah, Mum was cooking again. Smelled like turkey. It was downright mouth-watering. And Kelly looked through the doorway opposite the front door. It gave access to the dining room and the rest of the house. "So were you guys waiting on me to eat? I hope not," Kelly said. "Not at all, sweetie," Mum replied. "The turkey's got another hour to cook." Nick snorted and looked at his watch. Anyone want to take bets on that? I say it's a minimum 3 hours. Dad gave Nick a half-hearted smack to the back of the head. "Nick, settle down and have another beer. And get me a one. You need to mellow out." "Kelly, can I get you something?" Mum said. "Well, I don't know what to drink." "I know better than to drink your water, so just a soda's fine." Nick and Mum headed into the kitchen to get their respective drinks, and everyone else made themselves comfortable in the living room. "So, Kelly, Ralph and Penny tell us you're working for the Weather Bureau," Uncle Bill said. "Oi, no job." Oh, this was going to be a long visit.